Welcome to Complinet Global Newscasts. News featured is taken from Complinet Complete, our news, analysis and tracking service, and your comprehensive view of the regulatory landscape. New laws have already achieved the major objective of keeping the US the preeminent player in financial services by modernising federal financial regulation for the first time since the Depression, a Senate aide has said. Ed Silverman, Banking Committee Chief of Staff, told attendees at a Financial Executives International Policy Forum, European regulators are intimately familiar with the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act and are following our lead. Noting that the federal financial regulators were off to a strong start in writing rules to implement the Dodd-Frank Act, Silverman said the agency's heads would update the committee next week. He said that Committee Chairman Chris Dodd really wanted his November 2009 discussion draft to pass, but a lot of compromises had to be made along the way. When asked about criticism that Dodd had made concessions from his draft in an ultimately fruitless attempt to gain votes from his Republican committee members, Silverman said many of the compromises had been needed to pick up enough Democratic votes to pass the eventual bill. The communications regulator Ofcom has, under an amendment to Section 1304 of the Communications Act 2003, been given the power to impose a maximum fine of up to £2 million for persistent misuse of electronic communications networks or electronic communications services. The previous maximum fine was £50,000. Ofcom's general duties are to further the interests of citizens and consumers with regard to communication services and to protect them from scams while ensuring that competition can thrive. We're joined by Complinet's Regulatory Affairs Editor, Susanna Hammond. Susanna, how would financial services firms come across Ofcom?
Well, Ofcom is known on the high street as the communications regulator, and it really is the retail elements of financial services firms that would have most to do with them. Ofcom look after the consumers. They have nothing to do with the industry, although they are funded by the industry. What they do is make sure that the consumers get a good deal out of telecommunications, whatever form they come in. Specifically, retail firms contact a lot of their customer base through call centres. They use dialers, they use automated technology, and it is that service through the telecoms angle that Ofcom will look at.
And why has Ofcom sought to increase its fining powers so dramatically?
Well, as a number of people may have seen in the newspapers, there have been a number of issues with what are called silent calls, where a call centre calls a customer and the customer hears nothing. They can't dial back, they can't assess really who has given them effectively the silent treatment. Now, one of the Ofcom's main duties is to prevent persistent misuse of communications, and this is perceived a persistent misuse. Now, dialing technologies are good, but they are not good enough to prevent silent calls. Ofcom has had a lot of heat for not stopping financial services firms in particular from silent calls, hence why their fining powers have now been increased from £50,000 to £2 million.
So why would financial services firms take the changes seriously?
Well, on face value, it is obviously the potential for them to be fined £2 million, but it really runs a little bit deeper than that. If Ofcom should end up finding a financial services firm the maximum amount, it's entirely possible that the main regulator, the Financial Services Authority, would perceive that as, I would have thought, not treating your customers fairly, and potentially even more seriously, a major breakdown in systems and controls.
Thank you, Susanna. Morocco and the Netherlands have signed a mutual assistance treaty to improve criminal investigative cooperation of drug smuggling, money laundering and terrorism financing, said the Ministry of Justice in the Netherlands. An official statement said, the treaty will make it easier for the public prosecutors and examining magistrates of both countries to help each other investigate and prosecute concrete criminal cases. Morocco and the Netherlands are linked by several hundred criminal cases each year, the Dutch Justice Ministry said. The treaty defines the parameters for various forms of cooperation, including the performance of searches, the confiscation of objects, and the seizure of criminal assets, the statement said. In the future, it will no longer be necessary to assess for each separate request whether the law of Morocco or that of Netherlands allows for the granting of the requested assistance, Ernst Hertzsch-Ballin, the Dutch Minister of Justice, said. And finally, Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission issued a reprimand to Cyprus International Investment Advisors for a breach of the financial resources rules under the Securities Ordinance and the Securities and Futures Financial Resources Rules. The SFC said the company had failed to maintain the required liquid capital on various dates between July 2008 and May 2009. Following an investigation, the SFC also discovered that in previous FRR calculations, money owed by related parties was wrongly included as assets of the firm and that it did not have sufficient internal controls in place to ensure proper compliance with the FRR rules. However, it said no customers or members of the general public had suffered any loss or damage as a result of the firm's regulatory breaches. To read about these or any other stories from Complinet in more depth, please log into complinet.com or contact us if you would like a free trial. Join us next week for another newscast from the Complinet Global News team.